Section 4. How to fix climate change. Chapter 11. Carbon tax, the market-based solution. It is time to admit that the current approach to fixing climate change is not working. More protests and promises, more solar panels and wind turbines, more subsidies, all of these just tinker at the edges. We need to resist the short-sighted call from campaigners, green lobbyists, and populist politicians to double down and make even bigger carbon-cutting promises. After 30 years of failure, we need to say enough is enough. The good news is that there are smarter, more effective policy options. We should find and implement ways to cut emissions effectively, both so the cuts cost as little as possible and so they do more good than harm. But we also need to harness the best of humanity, the innovative spirit and creativity that can generate new solutions. In this section, I will outline 5 key policies that most people can agree on because they are a smart and effective way to tackle climate change. The first way to tackle climate change is to effectively implement a tax on carbon dioxide emissions, usually just called a carbon tax. I want to first focus on why we should have a carbon tax and then at what level it should be set. Carbon taxes can aggressively reduce emissions and thereby limit global warming's most damaging effects at fairly low cost. This is not a controversial idea. Most economists agree that the most effective way to reduce the worst damage of climate change is to levy a tax on carbon dioxide emissions. These emissions are simply a byproduct of burning fossil fuels to achieve productive things, like harvesting crops, pumping water, and keeping medicine cool. The benefits accrue to the person or company making the emissions and to the consumers of the products they make, but the negative effects, carbon dioxide emissions and their impact on temperatures, are spread over a large population. This is a classic example of a market failure. One person gets the benefits, someone else gets most of the disbenefits. On a much smaller scale, imagine that you burn a fire in your home's fireplace. It creates a lot of annoying, dirty smoke that makes you cough and soot that covers everything. If you build a tall smokestack, you've solved the problem, for you, and shared it with a much larger population. The problem itself, though, hasn't been solved. There are various ways to tackle the market failure at the heart of climate change. The reason a market works in the first place is that prices are supposed to deliver all the information we need. When you sit down in a restaurant to order wild-caught salmon, you don't need to know whether this is the right reason for salmon fishing in Alaska, whether the seas have been rough or the trip to the harbor was particularly difficult, or whether the chef is having financial problems. You simply look at the price and make your choice based on that, which should already incorporate all these factors into one number. The market failure comes when some costs do not show up in the final price. For example, the carbon dioxide emitted by the fishing boat and the planes and trucks that brought the fish to market, all of which will cause some climate problems. One solution to the market failure could be to ban the use of fossil fuels. That would be terribly inefficient, since it means that humanity would forego any benefit, no matter how large, from fossil fuels in order to avoid the negative impact from climate change. Another solution would be a set of regulations. The government could decide how much carbon dioxide the boat is allowed to emit, restrict flights and what cargo can be flown where, and control how far trucks are allowed to drive to deliver the salmon. But to control all these emissions of carbon dioxide, governments would essentially need to regulate every minute part of the economy. Every regulation bears a cost. It ties up businesses and citizens in a little more red tape. At the required scale, the price tag would be huge. Instead, economists point out that we can correct the market failure with relative ease by putting a cost on the carbon dioxide that is emitted to make sure the price of any product or service, including the fish we are ordering at a restaurant, incorporates the climate damage it will cause. This is essentially what a carbon tax does. It forces you to take into account the climate disbenefits that your purchase is responsible for, so you can weigh these against the benefit. Let's consider what happens to our salmon. Carbon emissions occur at each stage of the process of getting the fish from the ocean to the table. With a carbon tax, the fishing company would pay a little extra for fuel. The transport company flying the salmon from Alaska might have to pay quite a bit extra. Even sautéing the salmon in the kitchen will add a tiny extra cost because the restaurant pays slightly higher gas prices. The carbon tax not only encourages each participant in the market to be more efficient, but the costs are passed on down the line. Eventually, the extra price that you, the consumer, pay in the restaurant reflects all these additional carbon damages. Now, if you really like fresh Alaskan salmon, you will just pay the additional cost. But salmon frozen and transported by ship instead of by plane will be responsible for much less carbon dioxide emissions and thus incur a much lower additional tax. So perhaps to save money, you will buy frozen fillets from the supermarket and cook them yourself at home. In essence, the carbon dioxide tax has helped you discover that your enjoyment of fresh salmon does not outweigh the negative effect of the extra carbon dioxide emissions, and it has helped you change your choice. If the carbon tax is set at the right level, it corrects the market failure so that the prices now reflect not just how difficult it was to catch and transport your salmon, but also its emissions along the way. Indeed, it doesn't just show consumers which products are carbon intensive and should be used more sparingly, but it helps energy producers move toward lower carbon dioxide emissions, perhaps through more reliance on solar and wind energy. And it encourages innovators to come up with new, lower carbon processes and products. Unfortunately, another consequence of this tax is that it makes everyone slightly poorer than they would have been. It forces people and companies to use more expensive technologies and fuels than they otherwise would have done. This is crucial to our discussion of how to set a carbon tax. Emissions damage the climate, creating costs over the long term. Climate policy through a carbon tax reduces those costs, but also causes its own damage to the economy. Having a climate policy means that we have to pay both costs, so we have to work out at what level a carbon tax should be set in order to minimize the impact of both. Like any other tax, a carbon tax can be set at any level that a government chooses. How does a government decide on the right carbon tax? There are costs to ignoring climate change and having no carbon tax, but there are also costs from exaggerating the impact of climate change and having a massive tax. If we don't want to implement a carbon tax, we will bear the full brunt of climate change over the coming centuries. In Chapter 7, we saw that the cost in the year 2100 will be about 3.6% of GDP, and there will be costs in the 80 years leading up to 2100 and far beyond into the future. Using Nordhaus's model, adding up all the costs throughout the next 5 centuries, as if we had to pay them today, the bill would be $140 trillion. That is the top bar in figure 11.1, which shows the total global cost from climate change damages that we would see without any climate policy. Figure 11.1. Total global climate change damage costs over the next 500 years for different temperature rises by 2100, using Nordhaus's Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, DICE. We can most effectively reduce the damages from climate change by having one carbon tax across all countries and goods. That way, producers can't just shift their emissions to a factory in another country, and everyone faces the same costs. Achieving a uniform global standard means all countries need to set the same carbon tax for all their emissions. Of course, this will be challenging to achieve, and we will discuss what happens if we fail below. But one global carbon tax is by far the best approach. It will be much more efficient than if countries all go it alone and introduce varying levels of taxes. Moreover, using a single global carbon tax is how almost all climate economic models look at the world. It's important to note that this isn't a tax we should set at one level forever. A carbon tax that starts out low and increases over time will be able to cut more emissions at lower cost. That is both because technological developments will make future carbon cuts cheaper. This innovation is included in Nordhaus's model, because stronger carbon cuts are more valuable in the future when temperature and damages are higher. If we aim to reduce the temperature rise to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit in 2100, we can use Nordhaus's climate economic model to find the most effective, increasing global carbon tax to achieve this goal. As shown in Figure 11.1, successfully implemented, this tax would cut the total climate change damage costs from $140 trillion to $87 trillion. But let's say that we aim for a 5.3 degree Fahrenheit temperature rise in 2100. Then we will need a higher increasing carbon tax to achieve this lower temperature rise. If the tax is successfully implemented, we could cut the cost of climate change damage to $67 trillion. As we cut the temperature more and more with ever higher increasing carbon taxes, the climate change damage cost declines more and more. If we reduce the temperature rise to a very low 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit, then the damage cost would be cut by more than 2/3 to $40 trillion. This obviously seems to suggest that we should simply cut temperature as much as possible because then the climate change damage costs are the lowest. In fact, this is where most climate policy debate begins and ends. Temperature rises are bad, therefore we must cut them as much as possible. But remember, there is a second cost. Cutting temperatures through a carbon tax reduces economic output. Let's call this the climate change policy cost. For the climate change debate to become more rational and pragmatic, we need to realize that we have to pay both costs, the climate change impact cost and the climate change policy cost. Making the temperature rise smaller means making the climate change policy cost bigger. In Figure 11.2, we see what happens to the climate change policy cost under different scenarios. Let's say that from 2010, we enact 0 new climate change policies. This means that we allow for the small number of climate policies enacted around the world before 2010, but we imagine that no new policies will be introduced by any government to achieve any of the many climate promises made in Paris and elsewhere. The climate economic model of William Nordhaus shows that doing so implies a temperature rise of 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100, with $0 in new climate change policy cost, as seen in the top bar of the graph. Figure 11.2. Total global climate change policy costs over the next 500 years for different temperature rises by 2100 using Nordhaus's DICE model. However, if we want to limit global temperature rises to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100, the model shows that we can most effectively achieve that with a global carbon tax in 2020 of $36 per ton of carbon dioxide, increasing to $270 per ton by the end of the century. This will mean more expensive energy, which in total will result in costs of $21 trillion. This is the climate change policy cost shown by the second bar of Figure 11.2. As we make climate change policy more ambitious, these climate change policy costs increase. Keeping temperature rises to 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100 requires a global carbon tax that almost immediately rises to a high $500 per ton of carbon dioxide. How would that tax level affect your life? Well, you could expect to pay another $4.50 for every gallon of gasoline, and there would be similar impacts on all other items containing energy. And given that it is a global tax, everyone in the world, even the poor countries, would have to pay the same extra costs. At those kinds of prices, carbon dioxide emissions would essentially be eradicated within a decade. Not surprisingly, this policy will be very expensive at $177 trillion. Notice we don't include the cost of the 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius target here because it is likely impossible to reach that target with realistic technologies. Footnote, as Nordhaus puts it, a limit of 2 degrees Celsius appears to be infeasible with reasonably accessible technologies, even with very ambitious abatement strategies. But because in setting climate change policy we need to take into account both climate costs and climate policy costs, let's now put both together in figure 11.3. The hatched bars on the left show the climate cost, which is declining with more stringent climate policy. The black bars on the right show the cost of the climate policy, which increases as our policies become more stringent. Figure 11.3. Total global climate change impact cost and climate change policy costs over the next 500 years for different temperature rises by 2100 using Nordhaus's DICE model. Climate policy is, implausibly, expected to be efficiently implemented across all countries and centuries. Optimal policy with the lowest total cost indicated. By adding the costs together at various levels, we can see the optimal climate change policy, the point where the combined cost of climate change damage and climate change policy impact is lowest. This is where the overall benefits to society are the greatest. If we cut temperatures beyond this point, the cost of climate change policy rises faster than the avoided cost of climate damages. If we cut carbon emissions below this point, climate change damage costs rise faster than the avoided climate change policy costs. In Nobel laureate William Nordhaus's economic model, this optimal point is to be found if we keep temperature rises to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit in 2100. At 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit, the climate change damage costs would be $87 trillion and the climate change policy costs would be $21 trillion, leading to an overall cost of $108 trillion. This is the smallest possible combined price tag the world can achieve. Many campaigners believe that allowing temperature rises of 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit is not nearly ambitious enough. But that is only because it has become commonplace to talk about incredibly costly or even impossible temperature cap targets like 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius, or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 degrees Celsius, without any acknowledgement of their costs or plausibility. Look at the emission reductions implied by the 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit and the 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit policy targets in figure 11.4. On the left-hand side, we see emissions over the first century. The black line shows how emissions keep increasing if we do nothing. The gray line shows what would happen to emissions with the optimal carbon tax identified above. The dashed line shows emissions under the climate campaigners' favored scenario. On the left, 3 possible emissions scenarios for the rest of the century. The black line is if we do nothing. The gray line shows the optimal global carbon tax discussed above. The dashed line shows the favorite scenario of climate campaigners, essentially eradicating carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. On the right are the temperature increases for these 3 emissions scenarios. Notice how the optimal tax immediately reduces emissions as the entire world adopts a common carbon tax in 2020. This would already constitute an amazing achievement. Then emissions increase somewhat as poor countries get richer and emit more, but just a couple of decades later, emissions begin to decline, ending with less than 1/5 of the level expected by the century's end. If the world were to successfully adopt this optimal carbon tax, it would have a transformative impact. In 2100, the annual global emissions would be cut by more than 80% compared to what they would otherwise have been. Even though the cuts in the early decades are smaller, the total reduction over the entire century will be half of what we otherwise expected. Nonetheless, the impact on temperatures of this intense emissions reduction resulting from the optimal carbon tax, as seen on the right-hand side, is rather small. It reduces the temperature in 2100 from 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit. This is because the planet's climate has a huge amount of inertia built in, which translates even fairly dramatic reductions in emissions into rather small temperature changes. Even as we reduce our annual emissions, the total amount of carbon dioxide increases, just more slowly. Remember the metaphor of the bathtub? Even if we pour in less water, the water level still increases. Moreover, achieving this temperature reduction requires the entire world to implement a rather steep carbon tax of $270 per ton by the end of the century. That equates to your average American motorist paying an extra $2.40 for every gallon of gasoline, and similarly high costs on all other uses of energy from fossil fuels. And even more importantly, it means every Chinese, Venezuelan, and Nigerian will also have to pay $2.40 more per gallon of gasoline, and will face similar cost hikes on all other fossil fuels. This will be a tough sell. Yet this is nothing compared to what would be required under the most ambitious 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit climate policy, essentially outlawing global fossil fuel emissions in a decade. First, it is practically inconceivable that this policy could be actually implemented throughout the world. Imagine telling Americans that they can have no gasoline for their cars by 2030, no trucks or trains running on fossil fuels, no power from coal or gas, no plastics, cement, fertilizer, and so on. Now try to imagine telling the Chinese to shut down 80% of their power stations, or telling India and Africa they will have to forego having plentiful, cheap, and reliable power in the first place. Second, even if we somehow manage this feat, the costs will be spectacular. The temperature will keep going up, though not quite as much, and the total costs to society from climate change damage and climate change policy would double, from the optimal cost of $108 trillion to $218 trillion, as seen back in figure 11.3. When politicians and campaigners talk about extremely drastic climate policies, they don't acknowledge, and perhaps don't even realize, that those policies have a cost to society vastly greater than the costs of the damage they are trying to avoid. We want to avoid climate change damage, but implementing a climate change policy also has costs. And the more ambitious the policy, the higher the costs. The policy that will leave the world best off is the one where we avoid the worst climate change damages and avoid the worst climate policy costs. Unfortunately, the optimal climate policy requires a globally coordinated carbon tax, and that is possible only in a fairy tale world. It doesn't ever happen in real life. It would require politicians to set rational, ever more costly carbon taxes covering every person on the planet through the next 80 years. Just in the United States, such consistency would be impossible. Over the next 80 years, the U.S. will have 40 different Congresses and could have 20 different presidents. Taxes are not set nor adjusted with global coordination and precision. Instead, they are set and unset nationally according to political opportunism, groundswells of opinion, and political setbacks. Look at France, for example, where President Emmanuel Macron backed down in 2018 on 13 cents per gallon green fuel tax in the face of yellow vest protests. Look at President Trump in the United States, President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and the many other politicians backtracking on climate policies. It beggars belief to think that climate change policy will follow an optimal path. The chances are basically zero that there will be one uniform, steadily increasing global carbon tax carefully coordinated among China, India, the United States, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the European Union, and every other nation over the next 80 years and beyond. The real world will see much muddling through, with some countries setting carbon taxes too high, others setting them too low, and all adjusting them up and down according to local events and political pressures. This will mean that any actual carbon tax will become more expensive than the theoretically pure model with a single global carbon tax. We have a good sense of how much more expensive climate policies could get. First, we know that the cheapest carbon cuts can be made in the developing world. Unfortunately, most actual carbon cuts are made in the rich world. It turns out that this alone makes the cost double because we insist on cutting where the cost is highest. Second, politicians often pick ineffective climate policies. As we saw in Chapter 8, the European Union has seen its climate change policy cost double from the most effective levels it could have been, because politicians didn't make the most efficient choices and couldn't help but dish out favors to some industries over others. Similarly, much climate policy in many U.S. states, including New York, California, and Hawaii, is based on the Renewable Portfolio Standard, a regulation that, according to economists, makes it at least twice as expensive as the most efficient policy would have been. Thus, it is reasonable to expect that the real cost of climate change policy will be at least twice as expensive as the model we used in Figure 11.2 and Figure 11.3 suggested. If anything, this is far too low because the evidence implies a doubling of costs both for coordination between the rich and poor world and for bad implementation in places like the EU and California, thus suggesting that the real amount would be at least 4 times the most efficient cost. To adjust for the real world, we can run the numbers through William Nordhaus's model again, but this time allow for the policy costing twice as much. Just as before, the costs of climate change damage still decrease as we reach lower and lower temperatures by 2100. Figure 11.5 shows climate change policy costs when we account for inefficiency. If we do no new climate policy, the new climate policy cost is still 0, but the climate change policy costs increase much faster when we acknowledge that they are inefficiently implemented and poorly coordinated. Now every other amount is about twice as big. The plausible cost for achieving the most ambitious target of keeping temperature rises to 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100 is a whopping $350 trillion. Figure 11.5. Realistic global climate change policy costs over the next 500 years for different temperature rises by 2100, reflecting additional cost due to political inefficiency using Nordhaus's DICE model. Now, let's again bring this all together in Figure 11.6, this time including both climate change damage costs and realistic climate change policy costs. The optimal temperature rise is now 6.75 degrees Fahrenheit versus 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit in Figure 11.3 because realistic climate change policies are more expensive. The far costlier climate change policies required to achieve lower temperatures would be incredibly onerous. They would force the world to pay close to $400 trillion to achieve a temperature rise of 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit. In a realistic world, starting from the close to no climate policy that we have today, careful climate policies can save us $18 trillion, the difference between $140 trillion in no policy costs and $122 trillion from the optimal policy. Reckless policies, by contrast, could cost us $250 trillion or more, the difference between the no policy cost of $140 trillion and the $390 trillion cost for the 3.9 degree Fahrenheit policy. Despite everything we are told, climate policies have a small upside that we should exploit and a potentially very large downside. Figure 11.6. Total global climate damage costs and total realistic climate change policy costs over the next 500 years for different temperature rises by 2100 using Nordhaus's DICE model. Optimal policy with the lowest total cost indicated. Let's assume that we all agree that our common goal is to create the best possible world for the generations that are to succeed us. That is, to create the maximum possible welfare for subsequent generations. In this chapter so far, we have calculated the welfare loss from climate change damage and the welfare loss from climate change policies, and we have looked for the sweet spot where we achieve the smallest welfare loss from both combined. But Nordhaus's model actually lets us take an even broader view and estimate the total amount of welfare available to society over the next 5 centuries under different climate policies. This is a much bigger picture and puts the impacts of damages from climate change and damages from carbon taxes into perspective, because climate change is just one part of our future. It may seem very abstract, but future welfare essentially represents what humanity gets to enjoy. This is all the good that we can make sure is available to future generations. We have a responsibility to maximize this good to help future generations as much as possible. In Figure 11.7, the black bar denotes the total welfare available to society over the next 5 centuries. It is the total GDP left over when we have both endured the cost of climate damages and paid the cost of climate change policies, the hatched area. Figure 11.7. Value of total global GDP over the next 5 centuries. The hatched cost is the loss due to climate damage and climate policy. The rest in black represents remaining human welfare. One important point to note is that humanity's welfare, the black, is large no matter which climate policy we end up choosing. Even measured over the next 5 centuries, climate change damages and climate change policy costs will not do more than nibble away at the world's GDP. In other words, climate change and climate policy are responsible for only a smaller part of our future welfare. It is likely that total GDP across the next 5 centuries will add up to 4,629 trillion, a huge figure. Damages from climate change and the costs of climate change policy will set us back. If we end up doing nothing to tackle climate change and reach a 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit temperature rise by the end of the century, climate change damage will be significant at $140 trillion, or about 3% of total future GDP. Nonetheless, we will have 97% of all resources, or almost $4,500 trillion, left for health, education, food, and all the other opportunities that build humanity's welfare. If we manage to implement a smart but realistic increasing carbon tax across the centuries, we can do better. With real-world assumptions, carbon taxes will be somewhat coordinated but not perfectly aligned, and they will rise across the century in all nations, somewhat haphazardly. The average global temperature rise will reach a slightly lower 6.75 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. The total costs of climate change policy and damage will be around $122 trillion, or 2.6% of the total GDP. This means that humanity will have 97.4%, or slightly more than $4,500 trillion of the world's future GDP left for welfare. Thus, the damage to GDP ends up 0.4% less than that in our scenario with no climate change policy. A realistic, moderate, and increasing carbon tax policy can definitely make a net benefit for society worth $18 trillion, or 0.4% of GDP. But what happens if we aim to enact much more ambitious climate targets through much higher carbon taxes? The total costs increase dramatically. Trying to keep the temperature rise to 3.9 degrees Fahrenheit in 2100 is still less ambitious than the popular idea enshrined in the Paris Agreement of keeping temperature rises under 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius. Yet the total loss to humanity from climate change and policy damage would reach a staggering $391 trillion, or 8.4% of GDP. Compared to the $140 trillion, or 3% loss from doing nothing, doing too much is far worse. In an attempt to ameliorate climate change, we will end up avoiding more of the climate damage costs, but saddle the world with climate policies so expensive that the total costs almost triple. The cure is much worse than the disease. Carbon taxes are a good idea and should be implemented as efficiently as possible. We need to be realistic, however, about what they can and cannot do. A modest, increasing carbon tax can be a very good idea if globally embraced, even if imperfectly delivered. It can ensure that we cut the most damaging of our emissions at low costs. Yet the impact of optimal policy will be relatively modest, reducing temperature rises from 7.4 degrees Fahrenheit to 6.75 degrees Fahrenheit, or by about 0.65 degrees Fahrenheit. The benefit will be worth around 0.4% of GDP. Realistically, a smart carbon tax will make an impact, but it can only be a small part of our solution to climate change simply because going further means enduring more costs from taxes than the avoided costs of climate change. We should implement a smart global tax. But if we want to deal with more of the climate damages, a carbon tax is far from enough. We need to look at other approaches.